Hey guys, welcome. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome back to our next Vice Presidential Series installment, this part 2, taking a look at the 26th Vice President of the United States, Charles W. Fairbanks. So here we go, part 2. Of course, yesterday was part 1, and we took a look yesterday in part 1 at the early life and childhood and, education and then law career and very early, political type career of Charles W. Fairbanks, our 26th vice president. And now today, in part 2, we're going to take a look at his vice presidency, his legacy in politics and in history, and then, of course, his death and his gravesite and such, like we always do here at Dead History. So, without further ado, as they say, I am riding solo here for this audio portion, so let's just jump right into it. Part 2, 26th Vice President of the United States, Charles Warren Fairbanks. Here we go. Vice Presidential Candidate. Charles Fairbanks saw his presidential hopes gradually slipping away. President Roosevelt effectively maneuvered throughout 1902 and 1903 to gain control of the party and ensure his renomination in 1904. Some conservatives considered supporting Mark Hanna for the nomination, but Hanna's death in February of 1904 ended any real opposition to Roosevelt within the GOP. With Hanna gone, Fairbanks became more closely identified as the heir to McKinley, but Roosevelt's presence, rather than McKinley's spirit, had come to dominate the party. Still, the old guard could not simply be dismissed. If one of their own could not be the presidential nominee, they would choose the vice presidential candidate. Fairbanks was the obvious choice, since conservatives thought highly of him, yet he managed not to offend the party's more progressive elements. Roosevelt was far from pleased with the idea of Fairbanks for vice president. He would have preferred Representative Robert R. Hitt of Illinois, but he did not consider the vice presidential nomination worth a fight. For his part, Fairbanks followed Roosevelt's example from 1900 by declaring that he was not a candidate. His friends, however, had little doubt of his interest in the position, and he privately informed Roosevelt that he would serve in any way the president indicated. With solid support from New York, Pennsylvania, and Indiana, thanks to the acquiescence of Senator Beveridge, Fairbanks was easily placed on the 1904 Republican ticket in order to appease the old guard. By avoiding controversy and contentious issues, Fairbanks made himself a useful running mate, conservative enough to alleviate business uneasiness about Roosevelt, but not so outspoken as to be unacceptable to the insurgents. Still, the reaction was not entirely favorable. The New York Journal called Fairbanks a mere blank wall upon which the influences that control the Republican Party can paint what they will. If the goal of constructing a national presidential ticket is to achieve a complementary balance between its two members, the Republican ticket of 1904 came close to being ideal. Roosevelt and Fairbanks differed from one another in nearly every way. The ticket offered balance both geographically between New York and Indiana and ideologically from progressive to conservative. Perhaps the greatest contrast was one of personality. The vigorous and ebullient Roosevelt differed markedly from the calm and cool Fairbanks. One wag called the 1904 ticket the hot tamale and the Indiana icicle. Fairbanks' cool demeanor often led cartoonists to portray him as a block of ice. Although friends claimed he was a very genial fellow in private and only appeared austere, the icy image remained the popular one, providing an interesting contrast to the strenuous life of President Roosevelt. Mrs. Fairbanks partially offset this impression of coldness. Cornelia Fairbanks had become one of the most popular hostesses in Washington, renowned for her charm and tact. She also remained active as President General of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Their Fairbanks' Washington home, the Van Wyck House, near DuPont Circle, occupied a prominent place in the capital's social landscape. Charles Fairbanks assumed the principal Republican campaign duties for the ticket in 1904, as tradition dictated that incumbent presidents remain at work in the White House. He toured all the northern states and spent the final week ensuring a Republican victory in Indiana. His task turned out to be relatively easy thanks to Theodore Roosevelt's enormous popularity and the Democratic nomination of the rather lifeless Judge Alton B. Parker of New York. The Republicans' landslide victory over Democrats Parker and Henry G. Davis unquestionably resulted from Roosevelt's popularity. But Fairbanks was now vice president, and he hoped his star was on the rise once more. He began making plans to pursue an even higher calling in 1908. So now, as I always like to do, let's just take a quick look at the election that got Charles Fairbanks elected vice president. And like we just said, that was the 1904 U.S. presidential election. Theodore Roosevelt, the incumbent Republican, with his running mate Charles Fairbanks, went up against Alton B. Parker, the Democrat, with his running mate Henry G. Davis, and this was pretty much a landslide mopping of the floor. The electoral vote count was 336 to 140 in favor of Roosevelt and Fairbanks. States carried was 32 to 13 in favor of Roosevelt and Fairbanks, and the popular vote was 7.6 million to just over 5 million for in favor of Roosevelt and Fairbanks. It was actually 56.4% of the popular vote went to Roosevelt and Fairbanks. So, long story short, they ran away with this election. There's no doubt about it. There's no debating it. It was a landslide victory in 1904, and that, of course, is what, Roosevelt was renominated, and that's what gained Charles W. Fairbanks the vice presidency, the office of vice president. So, of course, you're seeing some maps and campaign posters and, all sorts of that sort of thing that I like to show when I am talking about the elections. And, so there you go, the 1904 presidential election that got Charles Fairbanks into office as vice president. There you have it. President of the Senate. In an 1896 article for Review of Reviews, Roosevelt, while New York City Police Commissioner, had argued that the vice president should participate actively in a presidential administration, including attendance at cabinet meetings and consultation on all major decisions. He even posited that the vice president should be given a regular vote in the Senate. Now that he was president, however, Roosevelt displayed no intention of following his own advice. That's pretty interesting. He did not invite Fairbanks to participate in the cabinet and consulted the vice president about nothing of substance. Roosevelt certainly showed no inclination to support granting Fairbanks a vote in the Senate, and, given Fairbanks' conservative tendencies, would probably have opposed any attempt to do so. Discussing the office abstractly turned out to be quite different from dealing with a flesh and blood occupant. The new vice president spent much of his time presiding over the Senate. He undoubtedly felt comfortable dealing with his old friends on Capitol Hill, and President Roosevelt gave him nothing else to do. As Senate president, Fairbanks had little direct power to affect the course of legislation, but working in tandem with the Republican leadership, he was able to play a role in passing the president's ambitious legislative program that included the Hepburn Act, regulating railroad rates, the Pure Food and Drug Act, and an employer's liability law for the District of Columbia. Fairbanks, Republican Senate Leader Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, and Speaker of the House Joe Cannon of Illinois also worked together effectively to bury unwanted legislation in hostile committees and to rule opposition speakers out of order at every opportunity. Fairbanks never had a chance to break a tied vote, but he seldom missed a session, and opposition speakers remained sensitive to his vigilance in the chair. In 1907, Fairbanks wielded the power of his office against his old foe, Albert Beveridge. When the Senate considered legislation for government inspection of packaged meat, Beveridge advocated charging the inspection fees to the meat packers, but was unsuccessful in his attempts. Later in the session, he offered this plan as an amendment to the Agriculture Appropriations Bill. In order to stop the amendment, Senator Francis Warren of Wyoming raised a point of order that the amendment contained general legislation and therefore, under Senate rules, could not be added to an appropriations bill. The presiding officer, Vice President CharlesWFairbanks, could either rule on the point of order himself or present it to the Senate for a decision. Senator Jacob Gallinger of New Hampshire submitted a list of precedents in which previous officers had referred similar points of order to the Senate for determination. Fairbanks promptly ignored these precedents and ruled Beveridge's amendment out of order, observing, "During the present session, the chair has frequently been invited by senators to submit to the Senate points of order on amendments which were not in order, and in every case of such invitation, the chair has felt obliged to decline to do so." Fairbanks took further pleasure in chastising Beveridge for offering an amendment that was very similar to a bill Beveridge had introduced the previous December. If the matter were of such large consequence, he asserted, the Senate would have dealt with it then in an orderly and appropriate way. The vice presidency may not have had much power, but Fairbanks knew how to use what he had. The most famous instance of Fairbanks' effectiveness as presiding officer came in May of 1908 during debate over the conference report on the Aldrich-Vreeland Emergency Currency Act. This legislation authorized the issuance of emergency currency based on state bonds, municipal bonds, and railroad bonds. The inclusion of bonds from railroad companies enraged many Midwestern and Southern progressives, who saw it as an example of the railroads' control of Congress. As Senator Robert C. Byrd observed in discussing this incident in a 1989 address to the Senate, filibusters are inherently much more difficult to wage successfully on conference reports than on bills. because conference reports are not amendable. Nevertheless, Republican Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, leading the small but determined opposition to the legislation, decided to filibuster. By holding the floor, La Follette and Democratic Senators Thomas Gore of Oklahoma and William Stone of Missouri hoped to force the leadership to drop railroad bonds from the measure. La Follette began speaking at 12:20 p.m. on Friday, May 29th. Either Gore or Stone was to take the floor when he finished, and by speaking in rotation, they could stifle Senate business indefinitely. A filibuster in the early 20th century could be particularly unpleasant. In the summer, an extremely hot Senate chamber customarily drove senators to the cloakrooms for relief. During a filibuster, however, if too many members left the chamber, the Speaker or an ally could suggest the absence of a quorum without losing control of the floor. This procedure required the Vice President to direct that roll be called, and if a quorum, 47 members at that time, were not present, the Senate would adjourn until a quorum could be obtained, further contributing to the filibuster's objective of delay. In any event, the quorum call allowed the Speaker a few moments to seek water or food and some fresh air. When Robert La Follette took the floor on May 29th of 1908, he brought a clerk with him to keep track of the number of senators present. Since the day turned out to be especially warm, senators had no desire to linger in the sweltering chamber. Whenever the count of members in the chamber fell below the required number, La Follette would stop his speech to suggest the absence of a quorum, forcing his colleagues to file back into the chamber to answer the roll. This cycle continued for hours. When Vice President Fairbanks ordered La Follette's clerk, who had been keeping count for his boss, to leave the chamber, other members friendly to Wisconsin senators' cause took up the counting. Finally, at about 11:45 that night, after 32 quorum calls, Fairbanks, under the guidance of party leader Aldrich, managed to limit the tactic by making a resourceful parliamentary ruling that some business other than debate must take place between quorum calls. Not until 2:25 a.m. on Saturday, May 30th, did La Follette finally establish the absence of a quorum, at which point the Senate adjourned until the Sergeant-at-Arms roused enough senators from bed to begin debate once more at 3:40 a.m., allowing La Follette a short nap. La Follette continued until 7 a.m. William Stone followed, holding the floor until 1:30 p.m., and then yielded to Senator Gore. Gore was to speak until about 4:30 p.m., when Stone would return. At the appointed time, Gore, who was blind, heard that Stone had returned, but when Gore yielded the floor, Stone, either by mistake or through chicanery, had stepped outside the chamber for a moment. Vice President Fairbanks, alert to his opportunity, immediately recognized Nelson Aldrich, who moved that the vote be taken on his bill. Fairbanks, ignoring other speakers shouting for recognition, directed the clerk to call the yeas and nays, or yeas and nays, I should say. And Aldrich, first on the roll, answered in the affirmative. Under Senate rules, once a vote began, it could not be stopped for further debate. After more than 28 hours, the filibuster was broken. The passage of the Aldrich-Vreeland Act pleased President Roosevelt, but as Vice President's other Senate rulings would not always produce such agreeable results. Roosevelt spent most of 1907 and 1908 fighting with Congress. The Senate especially erected roadblocks to the president's legislative initiatives, particularly those seeking to expand the powers of the executive branch. Roosevelt believed that Congress was incapable of making the kind of informed, disinterested decisions necessary to regulate the nation's powerful trusts. He preferred to rely on executive agencies, staffed by experts whom he considered capable of maintaining a careful watch over the nation's business community. He argued that efficient executive power, rather than clumsy, intermittent legislation, would most effectively deal with the trusts. The Hepburn Bill included provisions allowing the Interstate Commerce Commission to set railroad rates, and Roosevelt pursued legislation to allow executive agencies to set maximum prices for certain commodities. While the Senate eventually agreed to the Hepburn Bill with some modifications, it jealously guarded its prerogatives against what it saw as presidential encroachment. Even a president as persuasive as Theodore Roosevelt had difficulty convincing Congress to expand the executive's power. Opposition from his own party in the Senate constantly frustrated Roosevelt, who attempted to rouse public opinion in support of greater executive power. For their part, many Republican senators bristled at the seemingly endless flow of presidential messages from the White House, as well as Roosevelt's constant public criticism of their cherished institution. Vice President Fairbanks' sympathies plainly lie with the Senate, and when his term ended in 1909, he used his farewell address to launch a vigorous defense of his Senate colleagues. He supported the record of the recent session against erroneous criticism that it was unresponsive to the popular will. The Senate of the United States, he said, was designed by our fathers to be a deliberative chamber in the fullest and best sense, a chamber where the passions of the hour might be arrested and where the better judgment of the people would find ultimate expression. Offering a Senate response to Roosevelt's bully pulpit, he declared, "A servile Senate was not contemplated by its founders." One point I wanted to make real fast before we, continue on here. It's interesting because, our vice president that we did before Charles Fairbanks was Garrett Hobart. Now, obviously, in between Hobart and Fairbanks was Teddy Roosevelt, was the vice president. However, when you really look at it, Hobart, as we discussed in our Hobart, installment of this series, he kind of was like almost the first influential and kind of important vice president in his role, when you really look at the administration of McKinley. So it's interesting that it went from like Hobart maybe kind of changed that viewpoint a little bit to Roosevelt, who, really obviously changed things, not only vice president, but then, of course, his presidency. But then when you're dealing with Roosevelt's vice president, Fairbanks, Roosevelt didn't include him in anything. He basically left him in the shadows. And the vice presidential office during this term of Roosevelt's presidency, it became an obscure, almost meaningless office and position again. It's very interesting. So I found that kind of interesting when researching Fairbanks, that contrast between Hobart, which seemed to be going in the direction of influential for the vice presidency, to then, Roosevelt, and then Roosevelt's VP Fairbanks back to obscure. found that interesting, at least. That was something I definitely caught on with. Hey guys, so I found a special guest here with me for a little audio portion of this, and I found Mr. Henry. Hello, Henry.
Hello.
How you doing?
I'm good.
That's good. So, of course, our next Vice Presidential Series installment, we're in the middle of talking about our 26th Vice President. Do you remember what his name was from the other day when we recorded video?
No.
No? How about Charles
Fairbanks.
There you go, Charles Fairbanks. Charles Fairbanks, good job. So what's going on? How's school, Henry?
Good.
Yeah? What about baseball and jiu-jitsu? Good?
Yep.
Everything's going good?
Yep.
All right. So, what else? Do we have anything else to tell the people right now, or is that it?
That's it.
All right. Well, thanks for popping in, Henry, making a little appearance here. Pursuit of the presidency. During his vice presidency, Charles Fairbanks also spent considerable time trying to secure the Republican presidential nomination in 1908. In this endeavor, he faced serious obstacles. His own lackluster image offered cartoonists and writers a favorite target. When President Roosevelt told columnist Finley Peter Dunn that he was considering taking a ride in a submarine, Dunn advised, "You really shouldn't do it unless you take Fairbanks with you." Fairbanks even earned a short mention in David Graham Phillips' 1906 expose, The Treason of the Senate, where he is referred to as the presiding genius of the Senate. Fairbanks' popularity increased somewhat after a supposed attempt on his life. While the vice president was laying the cornerstone for a new federal building in Flint, Michigan, police arrested a man in the crowd carrying a .32 caliber revolver in pockets full of socialistic literature. This incident surely evoked memories of the assassination of President McKinley. Fairbanks also tried to use favorable publicity to bolster his image. So real quick, guys, because I find this stuff fascinating, I'm going to read you a little excerpt from a book called Protecting the Presidential Candidates from JFK to Biden. So in this book, there is a little excerpt here that says, and I quote, "However, there is compelling evidence that 2 more vice presidents should now be added to that list. Theodore Roosevelt's Vice President Charles W. Fairbanks and Lyndon Johnson's Vice President Hubert Humphrey. The attempt to assassinate Fairbanks is revealed here for the first time. Following President McKinley's assassination in 1901, Senator Charles Fairbanks became an outspoken advocate for banning anarchists from entering the country. In a speech he gave after the death of McKinley, he said, "The anarchist stands as the personification of the destroyer. It certainly is consistent with the spirit of our Constitution to protect ourselves against anarchism by federal action of a drastic character." The attempted assassination against Fairbanks occurred in Flint, Michigan in June of 1905, the year he became Theodore Roosevelt's vice president. He traveled to Flint to lay the cornerstone of the new federal building. The ceremony was attended by a 2,000-strong crowd. Fairbanks had been speaking for 20 minutes when 32-year-old James McConnell, later described as a blacksmith and anarchist, forced his way through the crowd to Fairbanks' side, holding a revolver concealed in his hip pocket. 4 police detectives caught the would-be assassin and choked him into submission. after McConnell was placed in a police wagon to be taken to the Saginaw Street police station. He told police officers that his time would come soon, that he would yet be able to carry out his purpose and assassinate the vice president. The crowd reacted angrily. Soldiers from the nearby army base in Fort Wayne, who took part in the ceremony and parade, shouted, "Lynch him!" and followed the wagon. During the confrontation between the crowd and the police, the anarchists reportedly pleaded with the arresting officers to protect him. After the incident, Fairbanks continued with his speech, apparently unfazed. As federal laws protecting vice presidents had not yet been enacted, the unnamed anarchist was charged with disorderly conduct. Flint police said the anarchist had stalked Fairbanks from Chicago and had intended to shoot him there. Fairbanks had stayed in Chicago en route east from the Lewis and Clark Exposition in Portland, Oregon. Responding to the attempted assassination, Fairbanks said he had been unaware that an attempt had been made on his life and treated the matter lightly. I had to put this little audio excerpt in here regarding the assassination attempt on Fairbanks' life, because I find any sort of assassination attempt on president, vice president, anything really fascinating. James McConnell, the attempted assassin, I could not find anything on him. I tried to find a gravesite, possibly. I tried to find maybe a picture of him. I could not find anything. So if anyone that watches this video has information about James McConnell, the attempted would-be assassin to Charles Fairbanks, please let me know, and I can send you my email address, and I would love to see any information or photos or anything anyone might have. So there you go, guys. Continuing on. He spent the summer of 1905 on a farm he owned in Illinois, trying to appeal to the farm vote. He had himself photographed chopping down a tree and cutting it up, perhaps trying to emulate Roosevelt's much-admired vigor. Still, no one outside the inner circle of the Republican Party seemed to pay much attention. The New York Daily News committed his obscurity to verse, saying, "Fairbanks was in town 2 days, yet no one seemed the wiser. He yearned to meet the public gaze, his own press advertiser. He strolled about the town at will, without much molestation. The only effect was a heavy chill and his own great agitation. A stranger on a foreign shore would scare up more attention, and he is feeling extra sore for lack of even mention." In his effort to attract support, Fairbanks' oratory proved less than appealing. The Nation declared, "No public speaker can more quickly drive an audience to despair." He seemed both uninspiring and out of step with the times. During an era of growing clamor for progressive reforms, Fairbanks' speech were full of what one observer called splendid verbosity, simply equating the Republican Party with prosperity. During the congressional races of 1906, he spoke often for GOP candidates, stressing the theme, "Let well enough alone." Collier's Weekly summed up his performance with another poem. Then Mr. Fairbanks waxed quite warm. His voice riz to a roar. He yelled, "I say to you, my friends, that 2 and 2 make 4. And thereupon all doubts dissolved, all fears were put to rout. Pie seekers said that Fairbanks knew just what he was about. He did not name unbusted trusts or mention Standard Oil. He did not talk of railroad graft, nor speak of children's toil. He said the crops looked mighty well, the cattle all seemed fat. The sky was blue, the grass still grew, and the GOP stood pat. And he let it go at that. The only substantive issue that really seemed to hold Fairbanks' attention was the gold standard. He had demanded a strong gold plank in the Indiana platform in 1896 and succeeded in helping McKinley make that a major part of the 1896 campaign. After McKinley's victory in 1900, however, the gold standard had ceased to be a salient issue for the public. Fairbanks' continued reliance on it seemed safe and popular, but not likely to create a groundswell of support. It was merely one more instance of Fairbanks' failure to keep up with the rapid political changes of the new century. An even more serious problem for Fairbanks loomed in the form of opposition from Theodore Roosevelt. The president had already announced he would not run in 1908, but he intended to choose his own successor. His list clearly did not include Fairbanks. Roosevelt preferred Secretary of State Elihu Root, but his age, over 60, and background in corporate law made him an unlikely choice. The president, therefore, settled on his Secretary of War and close friend, William Howard Taft, using the power of his office to secure convention delegations loyal to Taft. By the time the convention began, Taft's selection was nearly determined. Against the power of a popular incumbent president, Fairbanks never had a chance. Roosevelt could hardly conceal his scorn for Fairbanks. The president liked to tell amusing stories about his uninspiring vice president and would often discuss his preferred successors in Fairbanks' presence without mentioning the gentleman from Indiana. When Fairbanks and New York Governor Charles Evan Hughes both showed some strength as possible nominees in the summer of 1908, Roosevelt seemed stunned. As he exclaimed to a Hughes supporter before the convention, "Do you know whom we have most trouble in beating? Not Hughes, but Fairbanks. Think of it, Charlie Fairbanks. I was never more surprised in my life. I never dreamt of such a thing. He's got a hold in Kentucky, Indiana, and some other states that is hard to break. How and why is beyond me." This strength, though, was illusory compared to the influence wielded by Roosevelt on behalf of Taft. After gaining the nomination, Taft went on to win an easy victory over William Jennings Bryan in November. Still active in politics. After the inauguration of Taft and new Vice President James Sherman in March of 1909, Fairbanks returned to Indiana to live the life of a country gentleman. He remained marginally active in Indiana politics, but tried to maintain a low profile during the disastrous party split in 1912. In 1914, the former vice president returned to prominence once more as the advocate of party unity. The Indiana delegation to the 1916 Republican National Convention supported him as a favorite son candidate for president in hopes of a deadlocked convention. When Charles Evan Hughes obtained the nomination, there was talk of proposing Fairbanks for vice president. The prospect of reacquiring his old position did not appeal to Fairbanks. He wired his friends in the Indiana delegation, "My name must not be considered for vice president, and if it is presented, I wish it withdrawn. Please withdraw it." When, despite Fairbanks' wishes, he was nominated on the first ballot, his loyalty to the party induced him to accept the nomination and fulfill his duty as a candidate. He toured the country calling for a return to the high tariff policies that Democratic President Woodrow Wilson had abandoned. Neither Fairbanks nor his opponent and fellow Hoosier, Democratic Vice President Thomas Marshall, aroused much enthusiasm. As the New Republic put it, Mr. Marshall is an argument for the election of Mr. Hughes. Mr. Fairbanks is an argument for the re-election of Mr. Wilson. Hughes and Fairbanks suffered a narrow defeat in 1916, but Fairbanks could take comfort that Indiana swung once more into the Republican column. After the election, Charles Fairbanks again retired to private life. He remained active in the Indiana Forestry Association, a conservation group of which he was founder and first president, perhaps his only similarity to Roosevelt. During the First World War, he visited several army camps to encourage the troops and spoke for the Liberty Loan campaigns. Charles Fairbanks died on June 14th of 1918 at the age of 66. Ironically, the message from the Republican National Convention in 1904 notifying Charles Fairbanks of his nomination for the vice presidency spoke in glowing terms of the party's unity. It lamented previous elections that had been made to appease defeated factions and rejoiced that this selection was not such a case. It compared the hoped-for collaboration between Roosevelt and Fairbanks to that of McKinley and Garrett Hobart, conspicuously passing over McKinley and Roosevelt. The author of this message surely must have been aware of its inaccuracy. Roosevelt accepted Fairbanks because he did not consider the office worth a fight. Fairbanks took the position in hopes that it would lead to the presidency. The two men never cooperated well and spent the last 2 years of the administration actually working at cross purposes. Roosevelt thwarted Fairbanks' bid for the presidential nomination, while Fairbanks helped to bottle up Roosevelt's legislation in the Senate. Charles Fairbanks was neither a great orator nor a brilliant political thinker. He succeeded by mastering the intricacies of the Senate and by avoiding controversy. Like so many other Indiana politicians, Fairbanks excelled as a political insider. He was skilled in the arts of political management and compromise. Those skills made him a valued member of the Senate and an influential state politician, but were far less useful in presidential politics. Perhaps an observer in 1897 had him pegged best when he said, "Fairbanks may not be a great statesman, but he certainly is a great politician." By understanding party politics, Charles Fairbanks advanced as far as the vice presidency. Yet, in an era dominated by the likes of Roosevelt, Wilson, Bryan, and La Follette, Fairbanks' political skills were not sufficient to allow him to escape the shadows of those men. So just a little more here. As a senator, Charles Fairbanks was appointed chairman of the Joint High Commission of 1898, which was assembled to resolve U.S.-Canadian differences regarding the Alaskan border. As a result of his negotiation, the city of Fairbanks was named in his honor. He was vice president under Theodore Roosevelt from 1905 to 1909, but fought continuously against Roosevelt's programs, particularly the Square Deal. And just kind of reading a little bit more, Fairbanks' career in the U.S. Senate was less than inspiring. In his biography of the Hoosier politician, Charles Warren Fairbanks, conservative Hoosier, Herbert J. Rissler noted that Fairbanks spent more time opposing what he considered to be unwise proposals than in formulating new proposals of his own. So there is a good book out there. It's called Charles Warren Fairbanks, Conservative Hoosier. It's a pretty interesting book about his life. So then, we spoke about that in part 1 and part 2, his time in the Senate. Of course, his political mentor was William McKinley. He was assassinated in 1901. But Fairbanks did remain a potent force in state and national GOP affairs, even after McKinley was assassinated. We know that Roosevelt did not want Fairbanks as his vice president. He preferred, I believe it was Robert R. of Illinois? He was a congressman. Robert Hitt, maybe? Was it Robert Hitt of Illinois? That's who he preferred, Roosevelt, that is. But that didn't happen. There were a number of factors working in favor of Indiana's favorite son, so to speak, Fairbanks. To party insiders, a Roosevelt-Fairbanks ticket made perfect sense as it matched an Easterner with a Midwesterner and a progressive with a conservative. Even Roosevelt could see the handwriting on the wall. It was actually May 27th of 1904. Henry Cabot Lodge wrote Theodore Roosevelt to tell him about a visit from Fairbanks that morning in which the Indiana senator indicated that he was at your service in any way you might indicate. He would not say that he wanted the vice presidency, held off as before, but yet made it perfectly evident to me that he did want it, and is after it, and means to get it. If he pushes for it, he will get it. Henry Cabot Lodge wrote that to Roosevelt. Fairbanks did get it, of course. He was the vice presidential candidate, and then, of course, was elected in 1904. In congratulating Fairbanks on his selection, Roosevelt offered scant personal enthusiasm for his new running mate. I do not see how you could refuse the nomination in view of the unanimous feeling of the representatives of the Republican Party that you were the man above all others needed for the place, Roosevelt wrote to Fairbanks, leaving unsaid whether the Indiana politician was his personal choice for the post. And although the two men were never close friends, Roosevelt even once proclaimed that Fairbanks was nothing but a reactionary machine politician. Their coolness toward each other had no effect on the 1904 election's outcome. We know that, of course, they got, they got elected. It was a landslide. We know all that. Trying to just read a little bit here about, his time as vice president. And there were things that, of course, Fairbanks did not agree with Roosevelt, some of his policies. The Square Deal program definitely was not something that Fairbanks agreed with or supported. One anecdote highlights the conservative Hoosiers' isolation from the more progressive president. Irritated one day by the continued tinkling sound made by a White House chandelier, Roosevelt is reported to have turned to his butler and said, "Take it to the vice president. He needs something to keep him awake." The president often received reminders from others on Fairbanks' ambition to succeed him in office. When Roosevelt planned to inspect a new and dangerous device, a submarine, humorist Finley Peter Dunne warned him not to go on the trip unless he took Fairbanks with him. It came as no surprise that Roosevelt turned to Secretary of War William Howard Taft to succeed him as president instead of Fairbanks. Contributing to the tension between Roosevelt and Fairbanks was an incident in the vice president's home state. Roosevelt had in 1907 agreed to travel to Indiana on Memorial Day to help dedicate a statue honoring Henry W. Lawton, a Spanish-American war general later killed fighting forces opposed to America's control of the Philippines. Problems soon arose, however, when Civil War and Spanish-American War veterans squabbled over their rightful places in the proceedings. A Spanish-American War veteran himself, Roosevelt, nevertheless wrote Fairbanks that, both because of their age and because of the infinitely greater nature of the war, our claims must not be put forward against the claims of the Civil War veterans. A greater controversy resulted from ceremonies before Roosevelt's speech dedicating the statue at the Marion County Courthouse. Arriving in Indianapolis's Union Station a little before 11 a.m. on Memorial Day, the president journeyed to the Fairbanks home at 1522 North Meridian Street to be guest of honor at what he called a big political lunch. The 40 guests for lunch were divided into two parties, one hosted by Fairbanks in the dining room, and the second headed by a U.S. Senator from Indiana, James Hemingway, in the library. One item on the menu received nationwide attention: Manhattan cocktails. A teetotaling Methodist, Fairbanks may not have drunk any liquor himself at the luncheon, but he bore the brunt of nationwide newspaper attacks on his character when they learned of the cocktail incident. Already nicknamed Buttermilk Charlie for his advocacy of buttermilk instead of hard liquor, Fairbanks had a brand new moniker after the affair: Cocktail Charlie. A leading Methodist official proclaimed that the vice president had been crucified by a cocktail. At first, Fairbanks took full responsibility for the entire matter, writing a Methodist bishop in Buffalo, New York, "I followed the usual custom in such entertainments. For what was done, I was entirely responsible. I have never had any apologies to make for it." But with the frigid relations between the president and vice president, Fairbanks had some nagging doubts about Roosevelt's role in the affair. These doubts came to light at a Washington, D.C. Gridiron Club dinner honoring Roosevelt as he prepared to leave office. In his speech, Fairbanks said that although he had often been assailed and misunderstood during his career, he himself had never thrown a line to trip an adversary. Roosevelt, the next and last speaker, responded in kind to Fairbanks' remarks, telling the audience, "The vice president says he never threw a line to trip an adversary, in that he and I differ. I have thrown a line to trip an adversary, and I would do it again." Despite the president's angry words at the Gridiron Club function, earlier he had expressed sincere bewilderment about the uproar caused by the incident. In his memoirs, Indiana Congressman James E. Watson told about a visit he made to see Roosevelt during the controversy. The president told Watson that the treatment afforded Fairbanks had been uncalled for and termed the situation ludicrous and preposterous. Ironically, Roosevelt confided to Watson, "I don't like cocktails anyhow. I like champagne." And that made the incident at Fairbanks' home all the more gruesome to me. Of course, the negative publicity Fairbanks received on the cocktail affair did not in itself cost the vice president the 1908 Republican presidential nomination. Even with that incident hanging over his head, Fairbanks proved to be a potent force at the convention. He could not, however, prevent Taft, Roosevelt's handpicked successor, from winning the GOP presidential nomination. After leaving office, Fairbanks and his wife embarked on an around-the-world trip. Even though he was out of politics, He made headlines again when the Pope denied Fairbanks an audience after the former vice president tried to address students at the Methodist schools at the American Church in Rome. On his return to Indiana, Fairbanks kept active in Republican Party affairs, but failed to exercise the control he once enjoyed. He kept busy by serving as a trustee for his alma mater, Ohio Wesleyan University, and for DePaul University and American University. In 1912, Congress made Fairbanks a regent of the Smithsonian Institution. The last political hurrah for Fairbanks came in 1916, when he was once again the GOP's choice as vice president. Although Fairbanks helped his running mate Charles Evan Hughes to carry Indiana, the duo lost in a close race to incumbent President Woodrow Wilson and his Hoosier running mate Thomas Marshall. The defeat ended Fairbanks' political life. Fairbanks died on June 4th of 1918. Today, when Fairbanks is remembered, it's more often is not for his political stature, but rather for his physical stature. Naming Fairbanks one of Indiana's two greatest senators in 1957 for a selection committee choosing the United States Senate's 5 most distinguished senators of all time, former President Harry S. Truman could only give this rationale. It is said that the mirror in the vice president's office, which once belonged to Dolly Madison, is placed at its present height so that Vice President Fairbanks could see to comb his hair. So lastly about Fairbanks, we just went over his vice presidency. He actually became the first vice president to serve a complete term without casting any tie-breaking votes as president of the Senate. Fairbanks, a conservative whom Roosevelt had once labeled a reactionary machine politician and who had been caricatured as a Wall Street puppet during the campaign, actively worked against Roosevelt's progressive square deal program. So, of course, we know that. Then we know in 1916, he was obviously Charles Evan Hughes' running mate for vice president. They lost, though, in a close one. And then his death and his legacy, Fairbanks died of nephritis. Yeah, nephritis. I just looked it up to see if I pronounced it right. Yeah, nephritis. He died at his home on June 4th of 1918 at the age of 66. He was interred in the Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis, Indiana. Fairbanks received the honorary degree of LL.D. from Ohio Wesleyan in 1901 and from Northwestern University in 1907. The Charles W. Fairbanks Professor of Politics and Government position at Ohio Wesleyan University is named for him. The city of Fairbanks, Alaska, and the Fairbanks North Star Borough within which it lies, the Fairbanks School District in Union County, Ohio, Fairbanks, Minnesota, Fairbanks, Oregon, and Fairbanks Township, Michigan are all named after him. In 1966, the Indiana Sesquicentennial Commission Sesquicentennial. 1966, the Indiana Sesquicentennial Commission placed an Indiana historical marker in front of Fairbanks' home at 30th and Meridian Streets in Indianapolis, Indiana. And on May 15th of 2009, an Ohio historical marker was dedicated in Unionville Center, commemorating Fairbanks' birthplace. So there you have it, guys. That's pretty much it for Charles Fairbanks. You see, a couple pictures right now of his gravesite there at the Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis, Indiana. It's not overly huge. It's a pretty fairly large obelisk there. Fairly basic, nothing tremendous. Pretty cool, but nothing over the top. But there you go, guys. That's his gravesite. And there's part 2. There's the life, legacy, and vice vice presidency and everything else regarding our 26th vice president of the United States, Charles W. Fairbanks. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed this look at Fairbanks. Stay tuned. I will have bonus footage of my visit, my pictures from my visit to Fairbanks' gravesite there at the Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis. But that's it. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for the support. Thank you for all you guys do. I really appreciate it all. Henry and I, we really can't thank you guys enough. Keep it coming. All of it. Comments, questions, subscribes, likes, all of it. And stay tuned for next week, because next week will be our next Vice Presidential Series installment. And next week is going to be our 27th Vice President, James Schoolcraft Sherman. So stay tuned for that. Thanks, guys, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye now.